Okay, I'm going to just give you a brief introduction to Erik Hammerstrom. The reason why I called Erik here is because very, very quickly, I heard him in Tacoma at the Northwest, was it Tacoma?
The Northwest District Convention.
Yeah, Northwest District Convention a year ago. And I thought it was fascinating, the things he was talking about millennials, okay, the millennial generation, about what our future is at BCA. And he'll talk more about it, but I want to give you an idea of what we need to expect, or what we need to understand about this next generation, which is the biggest generation after the baby boomers. Erik grew up in Aloha, Oregon, and became involved in Buddhism in high school, largely due to his parents' interest in Zen. After college, he moved to South Korea for several years as he considered becoming a monk. He decided to become a scholar instead, earning an MA in Asian religion at the University of Hawaii and a PhD in Buddhism at Indiana University. His primary research area is modern Chinese Buddhism, and his book was published by Columbia University Press in 2015. After spending many years practicing Zen, Erik became disillusioned and started attending the Tacoma Buddhist Temple. He now serves at the Buddhist Temple Educational Committee and occasionally teaches in high school Dharma school class. He is also charged of the vegetable washing crew. Oh, very important. Washing crew, that's very educational right there. And his very moment, probably thinking about Sukiyaki fundraiser next weekend. He's an MA in training. Like I said, I want to first thank Erik for coming all this way, and I think you should all listen with both ears because you've got to be concerned about your temples, okay, future temple membership. So, Erik, I want to give you applause, and thank you very much for coming.
Thank you. Thanks. So I've got a lapel mic. Is that coming through? Okay. All right. So can you hear me now? Yes. Excellent. I'll put on my teacher voice as well. Hello, everyone. Thank you, President Tanimoto, for introducing me. Thank you. I'm very much grateful for having the opportunity to come and speak with all of you today on this topic. As Ken said, my research is primarily modern Chinese Buddhism and not so much the US, but at the last district convention, Jun Akita from our temple said, hey, we'd like you to give a talk. And when Jun tells you to give a talk, you give a talk. So I gave this talk at the district convention, and I guess it's useful, and I hope it is. I teach college students. I teach students who are the very youngest of my students, who are first-year students, are Generation Z. So the millennials are now, they're almost all out of college. They're finishing up college, that generation, and they're moving along. And this is the future. These are the generation that is going to come up. They're going to be running our temples, and they are already in positions of leadership. And the purpose of this talk is really, my motivation is that I think, to some extent, millennials get a bad rap. They certainly have been blamed for all kinds of things in the press. And as someone who spends a lot of time with millennials and thinking about them and their futures, I thought I wanted to set the record straight around a few things. So I'm going to speak fairly quickly. I'm going to tell you this talk has 3 parts, and likely the 3rd part will be moved to this evening's workshop. At this evening's workshop, I'll be talking just a little bit, and then I'll be turning things over to a panel of younger members who will be sharing their thoughts about Buddhism, Jodo Shinshu, and the future. So some of this will be moved to the end, but we will see how we can do here. As we go forward with this talk, I do want to note that some of this talk is not happy. It does concern some trends that are not entirely optimistic. I am optimistic about young people, and I think I've talked to some of you here, and I think that optimism is here. But I think as an institution, we in the BCA have to be aware of trends. And again, a lot of what I'm going to talk about here, I think, are things that you've encountered and have thought about deeply as temple leaders and leaders in the community. So again, given the conversations that have just been happening, I'm aware that there is tension around questions of finances and so forth, and that is one of the many things I'll be talking about here. So just to give us some clarification, Millennials, basic definition, are people born in the 80s and 90s. You can kind of, the edges of that get fuzzy, but this whole thing is kind of fuzzy, so just a good memory device is 80s and 90s. Anyone born in the 80s and 90s, more or less, is a millennial. They were the largest. I think they're now been eclipsed by Generation Z, or iGen, or there's a bunch of other stuff people call them. As I go forward, I want to note that as we talk about generational change, as we talk about change in the US, it's important to keep in mind two Buddhist themes, right? Two important Buddhist themes. One, conditioned arising, right? This is something that the bishop touched on a little this morning in his addresses, right? We as Buddhists, we do not see things as independently arising of themselves, right? Things can only come to be because of the causes and the conditions that make it possible. So as we consider what's up with millennials, we have to first begin by looking at what are the causes and conditions around this generation. What are the things that are influencing them? What are the things that have influenced them as they've gotten older? And second, related to this, is the question, the fact of impermanence. This is another key theme. So these are the two Buddhist themes that run through what I'm going to say today and this evening. This talk has three parts. First, I want to talk broadly about cultural changes in the United States, really over the last half century. Second, I want to talk about economic realities that have shaped millennials' choices and which they are very keenly aware of, which you are very keenly aware of, to the millennial members in the audience. Finally, I'll talk briefly about millennial demographics, and that's probably where we will run to the end of our time. I'll resume that discussion at 7 o'clock tonight. So one of the large issues facing our organization, as face many organizations in the United States, is a general decline of civic organizations in the US. This has happened across the spectrum, all types of civic organizations, and it is a trend that has been operating for half a century or so. This is a reality. It is not something that is something we're totally clear on why it's happening. I'm sure Dr. Kashima, as a sociologist, right, has probably studied this much and has insight that he could offer us. Of course, related to this is a decline in religious affiliation, right? Again, this is a broad issue. It's not unique to the BCA. It is not unique to religious organizations, but religious organizations are particularly dealing with this. I teach at a Lutheran university. It is associated with the liberal branch of Lutheranism in America. That is a mainland Protestant religious organization. And in many ways, its history is similar to that of the BCA, including its current challenges. So these are things I hear a lot about, both at my temple, but also at my school, which is owned by the Lutheran Church. So as we think about cultural difference, generational difference, here's where I want to just kind of reflect briefly, right? I did not grow up in a Buddhist temple. My parents became interested in Buddhism when I was in high school, but they were never involved in kind of institutionally heavy Buddhist groups, such as the BCA. So, right, I don't have a background in that. I am Caucasian American, right? I'm not Japanese American, so I didn't grow up with the same kind of cultural upbringing that a lot of people in the BCA, the majority of people in the BCA did. That said, I think we have to be careful thinking about what is different because someone is coming into the BCA who doesn't have a Japanese American or Buddhist background, right? Versus things that are happening kind of across everybody in the culture, right? So there are generational changes that are happening across every kind of ethnic group. There are also cultural differences between groups, right? So this is not to say, particularly again, with what Professor Kashima was talking about yesterday, this is not to elide the kind of specialness and the value of the Japanese cultural element in the BCA, right? There are very strong contributions that continue and I think should continue even as people from outside, right, join. But I think it's also important to be aware that there are things that are changing broadly that are not necessarily tied to ethnicity. So the example I would give is my grandfather on my mother's side, who was born and raised in Minnesota and was involved in the Lutheran Church. and he would have been at home in any BCA temple in terms of the time commitment and volunteer required. He drove, he delivered food, he eventually became a Catholic, but he was always volunteering. He sang in the choir. He participated in everything. Every time someone said, we need something, my grandfather was there. He helped on the weekends, building this or working on that. And that is not something that my parents even really kind of picked up. Right? So there's been a generational change in my family, in my Caucasian family, away from the kind of heavy institutional involvement. So again, it's something to think about, that this is something that's happening broadly across the culture. One of the sources I have for looking at this is a book called Bowling Alone, which basically charts, it's a sociological book, quite popular. It charts the decline of civic organizations in the United States. Really, the argument that the author makes, some of the causes part have been kind of picked apart within sociology circles, but the general observation is fairly true, which is since the 1960s, broadly in the United States, civic organizations have declined. This includes civics organizations such as the Freemasons, the Eagles, JACL, Sons of Norway, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Right? This is everywhere. In fact, if we look at numbers, the best metrics we can find, and we don't always have great metrics, really the high point of these organizations was the 60s. So this is not a new phenomenon, but it's one that's really catching up with us. Right? In Tacoma, the Eagles, it's the Eagles or the Elks? So I didn't grow up in this. My parents weren't involved, so I can't really remember the difference. They sold their old place, and it's now a Walmart. Right? That's very indicative of what is going on broadly. So this is a broad trend. This is not something that any one of us can point to as we are failing because our institutions are declining. It's a trend of American life. We're moving away from civic voluntary organizations. Of course, the biggest one of those, the biggest voluntary organization we have in the United States is religion. Right? And this has also seen a large decline. Currently, somewhere around 1 out of 5 American adults identifies as a nun. Right? For where I live in the Pacific Northwest, it's twice as high. And of course, this is also generational. The younger you get, the less religious affiliation. So I'll talk more about this later, but when I teach classes on religion, I can assume that more than half my students have never had any experience with formal religious practice. So young people aren't getting this kind of background. This is, again, a trend that is accelerating, right? In some places more than others. I think California is probably on the acceleration, higher acceleration. Pacific Northwest, certainly. American South, less so. So these are two big trends that are affecting millennials, right? Millennials are experiencing this. They're growing up in societies where their parents are not really involved in voluntary organizations. Right? It's less common for someone growing up today to have experience going somewhere on Sunday and volunteering. Right? So people who aren't coming up in religious institutions don't necessarily have a background in what that whole thing is like. Second, economic realities. And again, what I'm going to talk about here is probably not going to be a surprise to many of you. First, I would like you to reflect on something. Where were you economically at the age of 29? Looking around, for some of you that was a little while ago. For some of you, actually, I think there may be some people who aren't quite there yet. So if you're not quite 29, where do you expect to be? Right? So I'm well past my 29, so I'm right there with you. Were you married? Did you have a house? Did you have a retirement fund or something called a pension, which I hear used to exist? Or health insurance? Did you have health insurance? How did you have health insurance? So where were you at 29? Let's take a second. So we will return to that in a moment. So for millennials, and I think parents of millennials, you realize that nowadays education is a must in the United States. Here is unemployment figures for those with college education and those without. These are from the U.S. Department of Labor Statistics 2015. Right? For those without college education, unemployment and underemployment, working fewer hours than desired and working at lower pay than desired, is quite high. So people know education is necessary. This is part of our reality. In 1990, about 25% of Americans earned college degrees. It's now up to over a third, which of course means millennials have to spend more time in school, right? Because now the high school diploma of before is now a bachelor's degree. And the bachelor's degree before is now a master's degree. You can see where this goes. So this is part of the economic picture. In addition, there has been declining income. And this is, I'm sorry for our Canadian visitors, the studies have also been done for Canada, and they follow almost the same numbers. So Canada, you are doing many things right, but this is one area where it seems that we're all challenged. In the past 25 years, there's been a 20% decline in income for 25 to 34-year-olds, right? 25 years. So we're talking about multiple different presidents, different political parties. There has been a decline. This is adjusted for inflation. So millennials are earning less than their parents did at the same age. In addition, their companies and employers have changed how they hire people. They do not hire people into long-term jobs as often. There is a rise in temporary, part-time, contract, and piecework, leading to some pundits to refer to this as the gig economy. Right? Again, this is not something millennials created. So the shiftless millennial who has to have 3 jobs, right, is not a choice. Right? It is an economic reality because of changes in how employment functions in the US and Canada. Of course, all of this combines to lead to declining net worth. The average millennial is worth 56% of what a baby boomer was at the same age. So income's declining, but net worth is declining even more. So back to the 29-year-old self, looking forward, the average millennial at 29 is worth minus $2,000. So if you said at 29 you had a good job, you had a pension, you had a house, you had some retirement savings, which that's in the black. For the average millennial right now, or these figures are from 2 years ago, the average net worth was a minus $2,000. At 30, that's about the average, moves into the positive. So it's even more minus before this. Why? Of course, declining income. Later start to earning, right? Because of the need for education, extensive education. And of course, student loan debt, which tripled between 2003 and 2016, and now averages $37,000. So again, if those of you who went to college in an earlier age, what did you graduate with in terms of debt? Did you have the equivalent of a new car's worth of debt? If you are going to master's program, that figure increases. If you go to law school, you're looking at a mortgage. Right? You have an additional mortgage even before you buy a house. So these are economic factors. Millennials are aware of these, painfully aware. I'm sorry for those of you who are in that age range sitting here to have to remind you of this, because this is a reality. My college students, the ones who are graduating with $37,000 in debt, I want to be clear about this. It's not because they are buying a new computer every 6 months. Most of my students work 10, 20, 30, and it's not surprising when a student is working 40 hours a week and taking a full load of classes. That's not unusual. I work at private liberal arts college, so that's one thing, but we are far from the most expensive college in Tacoma, let alone right on the West Coast or in the US. So one thing I really want to emphasize here is that millennials did not create their economic conditions. Okay. Who did? Their parents did, yeah. This also means that, and this is these all appear to be long-term trends. So for us in the BCA, for any institution, even if millennials have the desire to give, they will not be able to give in the same way that previous generations have because of the debt, because of the declining income. Certainly expense of healthcare, all these things factor into it, right? So this is a kind of bad news moment, but it's something to always be aware of, right? It's not because they don't care, it's not because they're lazy. It's because there are larger causes and conditions that have changed how the game works in the US, and that seem to be continuing to make that change happen. So I want to shift now from the broader context to looking a little more at millennials in particular. There's a couple things to pay attention to, especially for the BCA. 43% of millennials identify as persons of color. That is the largest it's ever been. This includes a lot of different identities, including people who identify as biracial, multiracial, and other identities. In particular, right, the BCA is heavily Japanese American, demographically. Japanese Americans of all Asian groups have the highest rate of out-group marriage. This is from the Pew Forum. Right? 55% of Japanese Americans, so this is anyone getting married now who identifies as Japanese American, it marries someone who does not identify as Asian, and 9% marry other people who identify as another Asian ethnicity. Right? So we're looking at about 2/3 of people who are Japanese American getting married today are marrying someone who's not Japanese American. Certainly, we see that, I mean, if you look at the Dharma school kids at our temple, when they're all lined up for like the start of the year, I mean, that's truth, that's reality in our temple. But for other temples, right, which are in areas where there's much higher percentage of Japanese American, like a much larger Japanese American populations, this is still going to be a reality. So it's something to think about, right? What is this going to mean for the BCA in one generation? What's it going to mean in 2 generations? Combined with this is also the fact that millennials are getting married later. 26% of millennials married between a certain age range, 18 to 32. Baby boomers were almost twice as likely to be married. Now, this figures marriage, and especially children, correlate highly in the United States with attendance at religious service. Surprised? No, no, right? I think a lot of people, you have experience with that, right? The kids, they come for Dharma school, and then they go off to college, right? And they don't come back. Or they come back when they have kids, right? This is a pattern, it's not the BCA, it's across the nation. I know Lutherans talk a lot about this as well. But it is just partly something that's there. There's a correlation there. This may also relate to a fact that 1/3 of millennials live with their parents. So I think we're really good on time. I will be done right at 3:45, so I'm going to take a brief aside to just kind of take a moment with this particular data point. The idea that an 18-year-old will leave home, move out, get their own place, get a job, start a family, and not live with their parents, that is a very particular idea that has a very short history. It's mostly North America in the mid-20th century. 100 years ago, that was not the pattern, and in most of the world, that is not the pattern. The expectation that children will move out immediately when they hit 18 is something that really comes about in a big way after the war, after World War II, and the boom in housing and the GI Bill and all these other things. Right? So what we're actually seeing is a return to a more traditional way of life. Families living together, right? Larger families living together under one roof. This is, again, something that was never outside of the norm in Mediterranean Europe, in South America, in Asia, right? That was always the pattern. What we're seeing in the US is economic necessity is forcing us to rethink our family arrangements. So please do not shame your children or your nieces or your nephews or your cousins or yourself or your friends if they are living with their parents. Instead, think about it as a return to a traditional way of life, right? One that was common among my ancestors in Northern Europe, was common among Japanese people, was common among just about everybody throughout history around the world, right? But I think there's still a large amount of shame attached to it. And I see my students kind of, that moment of like, oh, you know, do you live near school? And there's like this, I live at home. It's like, no, that's fine, really, it's fine. Like, I think that's great. You know, like, it can be challenging to live with your parents, but it's a wonderful thing as well. I love my parents, and I'm sad that we don't live in the same town, so honestly. I also wanted to kind of dispel the myth. Millennials, only about a quarter of those who are living with their parents are what economists would consider idle, so not working and not in school. So that's a quarter of a third, right? So it's already a pretty small group. Most of the millennials who are living with their parents are working and or are in school. This, I think, is a really interesting point for temples. I think there's some kind of opportunity here. I've noticed at our temple, there's a couple kids, they're 20-somethings who live with their parents. They had attended Dharma school. They went off to college. One of them stopped attending, and now she's coming back, and she comes back with her mom. So I wonder if the temples can be a place for people who are in their 20s, who are in their 30s, who are living at home, right? If that's going to facilitate those children coming back to temple. I'm not sure. I haven't been able to think this through too much, but I feel like there is some kind of thing we can think about, especially as this becomes more common. I will be talking more about millennial attitudes, and we'll have some honest-to-God millennials talking about their attitudes at the workshop at 7 o'clock. So very briefly, I want to just give a shout out to Dr. Stephanie Juhas from Naropa, a Buddhist university. She's doing a lot of work on this. I was hoping that her book would be out by the time of this convention so I could plug it. It's not, but when her book does come out, I will suggest you buy it. She's done a lot of interviews and looking at survey and so forth to try to understand religious attitudes. A couple points, and this is my last slide. A few things to say about millennials and their attitudes. Millennials have a strong awareness of change. It's a good thing to be aware of as a Buddhist, as well as the fluidity of the self. The fact that your self is not a given, it's something that's determined by your context, by your social media platform, right, or something like that. I think there's a lot of opportunity for Buddhism to provide guidance, and also to for millennials to be able to kind of teach out of their experience of these things, of change and the fluidity of the self. Millennials are also highly committed to altruism and diversity, right? As I noted, they are a very diverse generation, ethnically, but in terms of many other identities. And there is a strong commitment to diversity and altruism. So the things that Reverend Dr. Matsumoto? Yeah. Thank you. That's very embarrassing. I've read your work and I have great respect for it, and now I'm on the podium and I'm probably blushing. What he talked about yesterday with the BCA's longstanding commitment to issues of social welfare is something that's highly attractive and fits very well with the orientations and the deep commitments of millennials. Finally, I would say that millennials, and this is Dr. Juhas's words, they seek meaning in life and rich content. Many are spiritual but not religious. They seek experiences, not things. They're looking for rich content. They're looking for the Dharma. Right? They are not as accustomed to the structures of volunteering, right? The nature of civic organizations as we have envisioned them in the US in the past. That is changing, and the whole context is changing around the millennials. But they have strong commitments, and they are commitments that I think in many ways are in line with what the BCA is about. So that is where I will end. 1 minute over. I will take questions later, so I can get out of the way for Dharmathon. And we will have more discussion. I'll say a little bit about Gen Z as well tonight as we begin our discussion. So thank you very much, everyone.